Joe?
Yeah. So let's start with that. So thanks again, everyone, for joining and bearing with us. This is the Internalized Stigma Workgroup. Great, we have Phil joining too. So as Alicia said earlier, the purpose of this group, or rather the purpose of today's session was to be pretty informal, just get people on the same page with what we're hoping to do with the group, see if people have any ideas for what they want this group to look like. This started a few months after last year's conference at Howard. We set up sort of like a Google website. We started talking a little bit about ideas, but we're still trying to get off the ground and determine what exactly this group will look like. So I can start off with a quick introduction, and maybe Alicia, you can go, and then we could hear from others. So I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and I'm a current postdoctoral fellow at Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York City. And I have a history of doing stigma research. Actually, Phil Llanos, who's now in our chat as well, he's my Ph.D. advisor. Working with people with serious mental illness. And now the work I do at Mount Sinai is with youth at risk for in the early stages of psychosis. And I'm very interested in how stigma manifests among that group as well. So look forward to chatting with you all today.
Yeah, so like Joe said, there was some interest in forming these interest groups after the last year's conference. And when it came down to actually making it happen, we happened to be the two that emailed Patty back and said we'd be willing. But that is not at all to define the scope of what we're hoping to do. I'm a psychologist, clinical community psychologist. I'm in Baltimore, Maryland, at the University of Maryland Med School and the Veterans Administration at our VA here, and focus on internalized stigma and the idea that until we manage to, solve oppression and stigmatization, generally we all have to walk through a polluted social atmosphere. And what do we know, and what can we do to help people navigate that with less harm to themselves and less harm to their well-being. But that is not to say that we're only interested in internalized stigma with regard to mental health. One of the reasons we agreed to volunteer to try to constitute this group is because that issue of internalizing oppression is just, it has very different contours for different individuals and different groups and different stigmatized identities or situations. But I mean, there's some real, universal struggle there and some real common interest, as well as some interesting cross-pollination in the diversity and variations. And so we were hoping to have some good conversations across, activist efforts and clinical efforts and research and education efforts, over time. And within that, wish, as Joe has said, we've had a couple of informal sort of meet and greet sort of conversations, networking. And that's one thing I think can really come out of this, is just cross-pollinating ideas and meeting each other and perhaps some sorts of, helping each other. But we do not have like an agenda or a project or something like that. We were really hoping to network, which is why the tech setup was like, no, we can't just do this. That's not what we're here for. So I don't know. Emily, you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I am Emily Petty. I'm a research coordinator at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and I currently work with youth at risk for psychosis, and I'm conducting assessments with them and providing feedback and clinical resources. And I'm really interested in internalized stigma of mental illness, but also intersectionality of internalized stigma, and particularly interested in how stigma impacts help-seeking behaviors, and specifically with youth and other individuals with serious mental illness.
So in terms of the etiquette of these things, I don't know, I can just say who would like to introduce themselves next, or that's probably the easiest, except that it leads to awkward moments, but calling on people seems too much like school. So who would like to introduce themselves next, whatever you'd like to say?
I can go, Alicia, if you'd like.
Well, it's all about connecting, so whatever feels right.
So my name is Vicky Hoverman. I'm trained as a sociologist. I actually work, I don't work in a clinical setting or in academia. I do a lot of survey research that has health relations, but I did my master's thesis on individual and perceived community HIV stigma, and I did my dissertation on perceived community stigma amongst men who have sex with men who are identified as Black, Hispanic, or white. So, but I also have a lot of interest in mental health stigma as well, and so this is just like my passion topic. I'm also the co-chair for the scientific committee for the conference. So this is the thing I'm just very interested in stigma and understanding it and connecting with people. And so yeah, that's about it.
Cool.
Did you call on me just now?
No, I just said cool.
Okay.
But
Oh,
you
cool.
can go.
Okay, I think you said Phil.
You're
You called it.
everybody. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll say, so I'm also in the mental health arena and internalized stigma, major area that I focused on. There are some studies that I've done where we've looked at intersectional, internalized stigma related to involvement in sort of criminal history, and also we did a study where we looked at intersectional stigma with people who identified as LGBT, and so we were able to look at kind of the co-occurrence and how the overlap and the combined effects of, let's say, internalized homophobia and internalized stigma related to mental illness, things like that. So those are things that are really interesting and challenging, hard to look at, so those are some things that I am interested in hearing about, especially, the HIV arena and some of the other areas that we're studying.
Thanks. I don't know, Charles, Christian, Marie, anyone care to? You don't have to speak, of course, but we'd love,
Well, hello, my name is Christian. I am at the University of Pittsburgh. I am a research associate there. I'm also research faculty at Yale, and I primarily work in public health and HIV. So a lot of the things I'm looking at are internalized stigma around both sort of HIV stigma as well as sexual and gender minority stigmas, particularly in racial and ethnic minorities. So we've done some things in Belize around sort of stigma and relating that to HIV testing by striking down their anti-homosexuality laws. And right now we're doing a lot with intersectional stigma. So looking at intersectional stigma and different types of stigma sort of in a latent model. And I do a lot with syndemics as well. So we're kind of relating all of these latent constructs of intersectional stigma and social support in the various ways that looks, and then using a sort of latent model of psychosocial syndemics. So that's a kind of how my stigma work is working right now.
Wow. Thanks, that's really interesting. That's great.
I'll go. My name's Marie Erb. I'm a clinical social worker, licensed in Maryland and DC. I've been in the field for a couple decades. And I have a background in, I worked for 8 years in a medical crisis counseling center as a one-on-one therapist, also ran groups. And I worked in East Baltimore with a community physicians group for a number of years as a generalist. I also had training in the affective disorders clinic in Meyer 4 at Hopkins. So I learned a lot there. And I think that a lot of what I've done, I also have done hospital medical work. And I jokingly talked with my peers about doing guerrilla social work, especially with some of my clients with depression. Part of their treatment plans was often, becoming an activist. And I know this type of social work was, this type of therapy was sort of prominent in the 60s, and I think it's time again. And so I'm interested in not just the clinical one-on-one, but also the broader social picture and helping people become active participants in that as part of their therapy. So.
Great. Cool.
Not as a member of any study or anything. I'm interested in that, but something that we sort of did on our own.
Yeah. And it seems that Charles either chose to leave or got, dropped somehow. So if they come back, we'll invite them too. So I don't know, it's kind of hard to forge a group, especially over here. And but I mean, we had a couple of questions that might help, but also are very interested in what everybody wants from a group like this. And Emily is our official emissary between the two worlds. Is there anything in the chat that we should include before we go on to try to talk more?
Yeah, so there was actually a different chat in the session window, but a really interesting and important question. So someone asked, how do you help a person with the stigma of having a mental illness? I used to have a lot of stigmas and eventually got the attitude now that I am who I am and don't care what people think about me.
Yeah, that is important. For sure.
Yeah, I mean, that's like the whole thing, right? So not an easy answer to that question, right?
But that's really what everybody's been saying in different parts of, whether it's just mental health problems or HIV or both, plus other marginalized identities. That really is the key question. You're absolutely right. And how to help oneself as well. So when we have had a couple of two other sort of informal meetings that were just from people who expressed interest after the last conference, one of the things that we were trying to talk about was like, where are those commonalities, but also and across our different types of work or interests. And what would help support what's important to you? What the things that you're working on now, is there something that an interest group like this could help to support? You as the worker doing that work, or
and all our officials come together and address those underlying concerns that perpetuate our people in perpetual poverty, in perpetual ignorance, in perpetual fear.
You as the worker
and to do
doing
that,
that work,
learn that all officials must come together and address.
Thanks, Gloria. Welcome. It's if you're on both this Zoom and the original, if you mute the other one, you might find that would help. Oh, thank you. Everyone who's on, let's see, the Zoom where we can see each other, might want to look in its chat where Emily has posted some of the other conference chat comments. So I don't know, Joe, what do you think shall we try to answer some of those and make our interest group the panel, and then after that we can go on to talk about what would help support each other? Or help me out here. What direction do you think we should go?
If that's okay with everyone, I think that sounds good to me. We can address some of these. I think there are a few of them, and then we could jump into sort of what you were saying before, strategizing about what this work group might look like, what would be most helpful to people, what people are interested in. I heard a lot of themes as we introduced ourselves. So.
All right. So we have just become a panel. Sort of, at least informally, but it really would be great to have the different viewpoints of both like location and emphasis and type of work people are doing on some of these questions.
Absolutely.
So The first one was, you can see if you're looking at the chat from here, is what is the root of internalized stigma? Anybody want to give some thoughts on that from your particular perspective? Gloria, I see your comment that it's different to hear as there are voices. That is not something that we are hearing, so we didn't know that, so thank you. You might find if you were on the other one, you might find that you want to mute or leave the other one so that you're not hearing that, because we are not hearing background voices.
Yeah, so in answer to that question, you know, I think there's wide agreement that, you know, the root of internalized stigma is social stigma. It's you know, discrimination, it's oppression, it's but it's also it's more complicated, at least in the mental health arena. And I think that this would be likely the case in some of these other areas where we have the intersections. So, you know, we have this modified labeling theory that you don't have to be told this by anybody, you don't have to be discriminated against, you know, you absorb it during the socialization process. And then if it comes to apply to you, then you sort of think, oh no, these things that I thought about other people, you know, apply to me. So I think that that's definitely can be the case with homophobia. With HIV stigma, I don't know if that's the case, because I don't know if kids necessarily have formed ideas about HIV the same way they do about mental illness, but maybe I'm showing my ignorance of the HIV arena in that regard. I don't know if the modified labeling theory fits in that way.
Yeah.
But I think you're on the right track. So, I mean, in public health, we sort of very similar to Brunford-Brenner's and other things we think about, so the socio-ecological model, and certainly that there are these influences everywhere. But because of HIV's origins, particularly in the United States, when we think about sort of the early epidemic, it's sort of tied along with homophobia. And so these things have kind of grown together. And one of the things that happened fairly early on is that there was also a racial component, the idea that sort of this was a white gay men's disease. And so by the time, you know, it was maybe a decade to a decade and a half later before we were able to really catch up and figure out that communities of color were also suffering from this. So I think there are, and from the sort of naming and labeling in sort of discovery, there's been a lot of that. But the extra piece here that I think is layered on top of HIV is the patchwork system of criminalization laws. And so even if people haven't grown up sort of with the same socialization around mental health, they certainly, by the time that they're probably adolescents and young adults, have come across sort of HIV social stigma that we believe in many places is driven by criminalization. And that patchwork is incredibly outdated, and means that, you know, sort of folks that don't disclose can have anything happen from jail and prison time to the sex offender registry to having that sort of thing like put on their license. There are lots of sort of, it's a large patchwork. And so I think that ongoing stigma, along with things like race and along with things like sexual orientation and gender identity, that nexus is really important.
It's also oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
There's also a generational component. We're having a point now where if you weren't born like within the range of when the epidemic in the US first emerged, now we have young folks who don't really, because you know, the discussion went away, but the illness didn't go away, and like and what people are dealing with. And so now you have a whole generation, you know, coming up who have a lot of misinformation about HIV, and thus the internalized stigma might look different for them, and it might be experienced differently because of the misinformation amongst their peers and in the communities that they're in. And then obviously what Christian mentioned, like there's also, you know, the communities you're part of, your identities and everything, all of that playing together. So I just wanted to add on to what Christian really nicely laid out.
Sure.
Yeah, and I grew up in, I was 12 years old in 1980, and when the epidemic started, I was, you know, a teenager, and all of these things were out there, you know, were very prominent to all the the negative stereotypes and you know, the marginalization, you know, the whole idea of a kid having HIV, you know, how would that kid be, you know, excluded, socially excluded, was like openly talked about, right? You know, and I think that those things have gotten better, but I guess what you're saying, Christian, is it really depends on where you are, what community you're in, what the kind of the overlay is of how responses are, and assumptions like, okay, well, if you're part of this community, well, it's understood, but not if you're not part of that community. And some of those kinds of things come into play in terms of how these internalizations occur.
Sure.
I mean, I know, like with my kids now, like they get HIV education in school, right? But that's not anti-stigma education. You know, that's just sort of like, oh, how do you prevent it?
And I would just say, you know, I think to kind of put a button on this along with the question that came in, one of the things that a lot of us are doing to try and sort of address these ideas around internalized stigma with folks that are living with HIV is we're also beginning to measure things like resilience and resilience across different domains, and helping folks recognize that resilience and how they might be able to use that to pattern resilience in HIV as well.
So sorry, everyone. That, of course, is feedback. And thank you, Gloria, for muting. I'm not sure how to advise you since I don't know what the problem is, but if there's anything you want to type in the chat that we can help out, please do, because we'd love for you to be part of this. So,
and I didn't totally hear the last part of what you said, Christian, but I know it was really, really informative. So if there's any way you could just repeat the last part of what you said.
Oh, yeah. So one of the things is that, at least in public health and a lot of the folks that I work with in HIV, we've begun, and particularly around sexual gender minorities, we've begun sort of developing resilience measures and helping folks recognize resilience and patterns of resilience, so that we can talk about the ways in which they've been resilient in other parts and other sectors of their lives as a pattern of something that we might be able to do in sort of living with HIV successfully.
Do you have any kind of a tool that you're using to measure different factors in resiliency, or can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. We have, well, as I mentioned, like most of them are sort of in development. This is a fairly new, I think, field for us. So I think we're trying a lot of different things and trying to get to the point that we can kind of sort of with like CESD and some of the other sort of well-known tools, we will have some to distribute. I don't have them all handy right now, but I'm sure I can send some stuff to whoever the conference folks are to make sure that we have that, you know, some folks have a look at them. But I want to say Dr. Asher Herrick helped build some of that fairly early on, starting in 2011. And Ron Stahl was a part of sort of building this. And I want to say Jeffrey Parsons was also a part of sort of building this idea of these resilience examples and being able to use them in the field of HIV.
Thank you.
Sure. Sorry, I don't have all of them handy for you.
I'm always interested in tools for resilience. Yeah.
Yes. Well, and maybe that leads to a next question, which someone had written, and again, Emily, thanks for your help in doing this. How can internalized stigma hurt you even at your healthiest? I think it's a great question, really. And it relates to that. It just made me think about people who talk about these assumptions about oneself that are pretty quiet or don't seem to be really existent until something happens. And that something could be different for different people, a situation that suddenly brings that idea of marginalization, front and center, or a difficulty or something that feels like a failing that suddenly brings these self-condemning ideas up to the front again. And that sometimes it's true. I mean, as someone said, that they had decided, I am who I am, and you can sort of banish internalized stigma to some degree, but then sometimes it can sneak back. That's one thing that question made me think about from the work that I've been doing and the people that I talk to. I wonder how other people would respond to that question. Other thoughts from other perspectives.
I'm thinking.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, it's fine. Go ahead.
Well, I was thinking from a mental health perspective. Building on the resiliency thing, curiosity is one of the components that they've done. You probably know about the studies that they've done about people that are a little bit more resilient than others. And judgment is kind of a killer of that. And, it kind of boxes you in, you don't have anywhere to go. Self-judgment then leads to all kinds of, problems, depression, anxiety, and it sort of kills the curiosity in somebody. If they're judging themselves, they're not being curious, they're not being open to themselves or to others, depending on which end of this you're on.
Yeah, I was also going to mention the idea of healthy. I mean, we often think healthy and we think physical health, but mental health is just an important part. And a lot of internalized stigma may very much impact your mental health. And so kind of looking at health in a more comprehensive form and bringing in the mental component, because to be like, if you're experiencing internalized stigma, there's likely, maybe you're dealing with depression or anxiety or other types of stressors. And so I think kind of even changing our definition of what healthy means and bringing, because mental health is, and having mental health conditions is stigmatized, that we need to kind of wed that together is, not just that your numbers are good, like, your viral low is down, like, well, what else is going on?
And I was thinking in response to the question about, two things. So initially, I was thinking, well, when Pat Corrigan kind of came up with this idea of what are the responses to stigma, people diagnosed with mental illness, we have sort of three responses: indifference, righteous anger, and then what we call internalized stigma. But that, and so righteous anger, we could think of that as generally healthy because it might energize social activism and engagement in, responses to attack oppression, right? But another way to think of it is kind of like with crosses, stages of identity development, and that, there can be a more simplified, knee-jerk version of righteous anger that can have some unhealthy aspects, and there can be other more developed versions of it as well. It's not just like a simple kind of yes/no thing. So I was sort of, like when I was younger, I did the opposite of whatever I thought society wanted me to do, and I did that just automatically. Like, well, if you're telling me to do this, I'm going to do the opposite because I reject all of your, ideas. And now I kind of think about it in a more sophisticated way. Well, maybe some of those kind of have a point, but I do reject some others. So, I think it can be like that too with thinking about your response to the stigma related to an identity, such as having a mental illness or having HIV.
I think that's a really good point. I've noticed in my practice that the less someone identifies with their diagnoses, mental illness diagnoses, the better they do. If they, yes, this is something you struggle with, but it's not who you are. And I just have noticed a definite correlation. If somebody comes in and says, I'm just, I'm depression incarnate, it's going to be a really tough road.
Right. And that's an area that I think the dynamic varies a lot by the different kind of stigmatized identity. I mean, in that you don't, I mean, even in mental health, if I am so not going to identify with what's going on to even use some of the supports that might help me feel better and function better, well, that could be a problem. You know, but you don't have to agree with the diagnostic label to do that. I'm not saying that, but I was thinking about like HIV as a different, also, if I don't even want to identify with that factually, well, then similarly, I might not avail myself of, you know, treatment, and I might not be protecting myself and others, but that doesn't mean you have to take on the social identity of an HIV positive person, which could be in a positive way or could be in an internalized stigma way, right? And then additional different dynamics when we're talking about racism, or you're talking about classism, or immigration as a, you know, something that brings stigma upon one's head. So I think that question of identification, I love it in terms of a protective thing to not be engulfed by the negative, but it's not simple because there's some real positives to identifying with these groups too. And how can we navigate that so people don't get harmed by that very distancing, but yet can get the benefit of it? I just think that's a really interesting. So if people from your different perspectives from different work have any perspectives on that, I would be totally interested. But of course, that's just me. Others may not be something the group wants to go to. And along those lines, another question was asking about aging, and on top of all of this, you know, how harmful, then you have aging in addition to internalized stigma, whether it's about aging or about other things the person's experiencing. Makes me think of your point, Vicky, about sort of age cohort and generational differences.
I was just refreshing my memory with Cross's stages. And so what we tend to think about with people internalized stigma, you know, would be, you know, in what he describes as the pre-encounter stage, you know, which is really very much the you know, the stage of like everything that I am is, you know, something that I'm gonna reject and think is bad because of its associations in larger society. So there's a lot of other ways that people can carry this forward, you know, if we wanted to look at it with more complexity.
Right. Anybody else thoughts on that?
Just to chime in with some anecdotal experience from, I used to work in the Division of Geriatrics at Weill Cornell in New York. And I worked with research participants who had chronic pain, and probably about 15% of them also had HIV, and then depression as well. And in just interviewing them, one of the most common things that I heard was, you know, I'm getting older. This pain and this depression is it's just part of it. Nobody wants to hear about it. Very, you know, these attitudes were getting in the way of them feeling like they could even be seeking help, or that there was help to be had.
I think that's a really good point. When people that are getting older say, oh, well, you know, I guess this is just part of getting older. It's like they're taking on this sort of, you know, I have to be, you know, sort of broken down and in bad health and depressed to be old. And that's just part. No, you don't have to accept that as an older person. And I think that is ingrained in our culture to some degree, that, you know, being 60 is, you know, is somehow, you know, indicative of being really just not able, mentally, physically, whatever. And as a 60-year-old, I completely reject that.
I would totally agree. Like, as a sociologist, like our culture, our our notion of aging in US culture is very different than other cultures, and like we devalue and we don't, you know, we don't see older folks as useful or productive, and by doing that actually, you know, there might create some other, you know, create some internalized stigma that may not have even been there because of that aging piece. And then on top of that, whatever else someone else is struggling with. So there definitely needs to be there's a cultural shift with aging, especially because that isn't the case, and yet we make folks feel that way, and why is that? And definitely
Right.
I think there are a lot of opportunities, I think, around sort of aging, right? And so on the, you know, one of the, again, not to drag you back to HIV, but you know, in our world, we have things like kick-ass, which is the AIDS survivor syndrome, and sort of helping folks deal with things like survivor's guilt, folks who lived through the 80s and did not acquire HIV, and folks who lived through the 80s did acquire HIV, but lived. Lots of questions, lots of concerns. And I lived for several years, and I did a good part of my research in Florida. And I actually worked at a few community-based organizations there. And one of the things that was really interesting were the number of older individuals of, again, in this generational cohort of folks who might have gotten married and might have, you know, had these sort of 2 kids and a dog life. And then, you know, post having, you know, their partner pass on, have taken on new life, and they are coming out of the closet, and they are transitioning at older ages. And you know, there were a lot of things that were very new. And so having to talk to someone who is 60 years old, who's kind of getting out for the first time, and we're talking about PrEP, and we're talking about how to know, and there's just a newness there that I think is less discussed, and I think is far less visible. And so I think that's part of it too, is that as a cohort, folks can feel very isolated. That isolation, which is always a part of our concern about aging, I think can get worse if you're sort of in a space and you're not used to things are new to you, things seem very quick, you know. At 55 years old, 60 years old, if you're getting on Grindr for the first time, Grindr can be a really harsh place. You know, so what are the kinds of things and what are the kinds of supports that we need to do? But that starts, I think, with some kind of visualization.
And something interesting about aging with mental health stigma as well is that, you know, there's a substantial number of people who don't develop mental health problems until, you know, after they're 45, 50 years old. And, you know, some individuals that I worked with or supervised people work with, you know, didn't develop until after age 50 or 60. And so those are things where it can be a complete challenge to your previous identity of who you are. And so then it's not sort of like you're aging with something that you've had your whole life, but you're sort of contending with something new as you are entering a new phase of life. I think that's not something that we're typically thinking about, talking about these issues.
Yeah, there's a question that leads from this in kind of the next down, as Emily had been sort of transcribing, and at the same time, I'm thinking that, so we have until 5:30, if people have till 5:30, that we don't want to totally leave behind that question of how can we support each other in this, you know, in the different work, but also in the commonalities of these dynamics around stigma and internalized and stuff. So I'm like, and I closed the website one myself. So I don't know how many people are also still with us on that side of the universe divide, but perhaps our ambassador can give us a little update. And for those people who are on that side, for those people who are on that side, again, especially if you joined in later, apologies for the awkwardness of this format. It wasn't what we intended. And there is, if you scroll up, there's a Zoom link which would allow you to join what you're seeing so that you can talk more naturally with each other. But also feel free to put comments or questions in the chat, and Emily, as our ambassador, will convey them between the two realms. It's kind of silly. So I don't know. So the question was the question that seemed to lead logically was, can we address coping behaviors and mechanisms that persons living with HIV could use to lead to better health outcomes dealing with internalized stigma? So basically, what do we, how can people help themselves in dealing with internalized stigma, particularly around HIV? But there are some commonalities. Does anybody have comments on that we can offer for discussion? I can say that I was part of a group that created a class that was designed, that we intended to do just that. And it does focus on mental health and stigma, or mental illness and stigma. But what we did, it's called Ending Self-Stigma. And what we did was try to sort of integrate and boil down whatever we knew, not only about mental health and stigma. We were really informed by a lot of the intersectional and Myers Minority Stress Model, and a lot of different strands, anti-racism and anti-homophobia work in particular. Anyway, to sort of stir everything that was known from lived experience and clinical work and research into, a lovely dough, and then put it in a loaf pan, and then bake it and slice it into practical slices that people could learn. In that, there is a number of strategies. And one of them people have already talked about, which is to not get engulfed by that particular part of one's identity, and particularly the negative messages attached to that by certain parts of society, to actively resist getting engulfed by that and sort of swallowed by it. But and there's a number of other ones, but they're not unique to our work. We really were kind of just trying to package what was known. So I'm wondering what other things anybody else would want to say about strategies and mechanisms that people with HIV could use to deal with internalized stigma. Anybody?
Well, I think you clarified it pretty well. I mean, thinking of yourself as a person who is dealing with HIV/AIDS is very different from thinking of yourself as, making that part of your identity. I think that it dehumanizes. Yeah.
Well, but at the same time, with the, on the activist side, taking on that role as a social identity can be very empowering. So it's not like it's how you identify, Some of the other things, and I'm interested to know if these resonate with other areas of work, or if they're different in other areas of work. I'm very interested in that. Some of the other kind of broad brushes that we built into this program. One is just information, that corrective information can go some direction, some distance towards helping dislodge internalized stigma. In the area of schizophrenia, where I do some of my work, there are some people who really truly believe that having the experiences that are often deemed schizophrenia, or that diagnosis, means you're not intelligent, when actually that is just completely incorrect. And some people are actually surprised and shocked to get information that they consider credible, rebuffing that myth. So just plain old information sometimes. But also, I have to say, naming, and I don't want to, and then I think there's a number, I think the next important one is naming internalized stigma as a danger. One thing that I've run into a lot, not only in the mental health world, but other places, is that people know what stigma is. And they know that it's bad, and they know that it can lead to discrimination, to disrespect, to violence. But a lot of times people don't even know the word or the idea of how it gets in your head. And sometimes we are more familiar with internalized racism or internalized homophobia. And then that's great. That's really great. But to name it as a danger, that it's actually a dangerous thing that deserves to be talked about and pushed back against, I think is a really important strategy. So other thoughts on that topic of mechanisms and strategies?
Well, I would just say I like the resilience model that Christian mentioned before, and I know that's something that you and I, Alicia, and some others have thought about in the mental health world, specifically with youth who are at risk for psychosis, who are a pretty diverse group, sort of thinking about not only the internalized stigma that may be present among youth, which is certainly there, but also the anticipations, the perceptions of stigma, and just sort of bolstering resilience skills in general, and coping and highlighting strengths to sort of buffer perhaps ahead of time, right? And sort of prepare for stigma that you may see or experience personally. That's sort of what was on my mind. And I was also just thinking relatedly, if it's okay to go to the next question I see Emily put in, it's a nice segue, I think, from what you were speaking about, Alicia, and some others, is sort of like, how can we help others to unlearn stigma?
Like the question of the entire conference, right?
Right. We're going to answer it right now. Yes. But certainly education, right? So the research would tell us that can be helpful, but what can be most helpful typically is contact with the stigmatized group, right? Either through a structured formal presentation, at least in the mental health world, right? So someone with lived experience talks about their recovery. We think that could help sort of humanize those individuals, break down some stereotypes, increase more positive prosocial contact. But I'm certainly interested in what others think too.
Yeah.
Right, and the idea that Pat Corrigan has is that people need to come out, right? So that basically the more that people are out, the more contact people having, right? Mm-hmm. That has potentially some benefits for people who do come out, right? Taking cue from benefits that coming out can have from the LGBTQ community. So
it can also,
right. But it also has risks, right?
One can't say that glibly, because it can also get you killed and other things.
Absolutely, absolutely. Depending where, right? And we have strong evidence of that. It depends where you are. So how do you increase contact, right? Because I think the idea that we have in the mental health field is that most people know somebody with a mental illness, right, or even a serious mental illness, and they don't know that they do, right? So that a person maybe that they know casually, right, could be a community member, could be a neighbor, or somebody works at a local business they go to, has a serious mental illness. They don't know that, so there's no contact opportunity there because they don't have that information. The person is withholding that information for good reason, protect themselves. So how do we create a situation there can be more contact opportunities for more than just someone that might be in a public service announcement or in a presentation that's given at a school or something? Those things are good too, but how do we create those other things? And yeah, I agree, Alicia, that there are risks, too, and that's just a hard question.
Yeah, Christian, I saw that you had to turn off your camera, so I don't want to call you out if you needed to, do something or take a phone call or whatever. But I am curious if you are able to be listening, if you have anything to add on that, because I was thinking about the various intersections that you mentioned when you were describing your work.
Sorry, the apartment complex came to do lots of things, so I didn't hear the full conversation, so I apologize.
Well, that's fine. That's why I started off by saying I wasn't doing this to call you out. I know people have to slip away.
No, I just came back in, so I'm not totally sure, but I think folks were talking about, I don't know what people were talking about, actually.
Well, the idea was that someone had asked a question about unlearning stigma, and we were talking about how getting to know people who are members of whatever stigmatized group you're talking about, a contact, quote unquote, can be a way of humanizing that group and eroding myths and eroding stereotypes. But of course that's complicated and can bring benefit, but also risk to the people who are being out in whatever modality and way and stuff we're talking about. And that led me to wonder if you had any comments on that whole set of strategies given the many cross currents that you were talking about when you described your work?
Yeah, I think most often this is a piece where looking at sort of sexual and gender minority folks and individuals of color becomes really complicated, because it might be that you could find a community where the folks are sexual or gender minorities, but they may not necessarily be folks of color, or you might find vice versa, right? And so when we're getting into these sort of really intersectional communities, we're looking at really small numbers. And so one of the things that has been sort of floating around and folks have tried to do is to really, there's been a lot more effort at trying to engage families and family units. And so there's been a lot of research around, for folks of color, how the influence of families can sort of particularly help males in health-seeking behavior around mental health and serious mental health issues, because family can sort of recognize it fairly early on, and that there are a few moments where folks think that they might get help. They're really open to it, but it really depends on how the family unit responds. And there have been a few studies around just thinking about, in terms of sexual and gender minority communities, acceptance journeys, both in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, I think, are the sort of social media efforts to try and get families to sort of more accept folks of color. And in that also has been couched in that individuals with HIV. So making this a sort of broader conversation and helping it to allay some of that stigma. So they've been trying to use this campaign to kill two birds with one stone, that first and foremost around sexual and gender folks, but also folks that might be living with HIV, knowing that that's nested within. Those are probably less about internalized stigma, though.
This was right. The question, it bridges both the question that was being asked. So.
But it seems like that, it is really important to have that really influential kernel kind of be ready in some ways. And, in terms of sort of unlearning stigma, I think that's very complicated. I would like to believe that that's possible. I don't know, though, because I think humans as a whole are really, I think we are sort of trained fairly early on to identify things and separate things based on whether they are alike or different. And I don't necessarily know that I don't know that societies have always necessarily measured that in good or bad. But I think the end result might have been separating for good and for bad. And so I don't know, maybe that's a more of an education question. I have no idea.
Yeah, I don't think you're wrong, but I do think sometimes we can actually help people see the commonalities or the humanities, so that we don't see that person as other anymore, but but anyway, that's a big question.
Yeah. It's a great question, though.
Yeah. If others want to take this in a different direction, please do speak up. I know it's a little funny since we've just mostly all met each other in this moment, but I really was interested, in the interest of this interest group going forward. Joe and I, as the co-chairs, were really interested in what would help you support, what would help you do this work with regard to internalized stigma? Are there things, not just like, what do you want from a group like this, although that is the question, but what would help you, do your work that something like this gathering could provide, or a network like this could provide? And since we have like 15 minutes left and we're supposed to stop at 5:30, I'm inserting that in, even though it feels a little bit artificial at this moment. What could you get out of a network of colleagues or whatever, comrades, trying to do similar work in internalized stigma across differences that could help you? Is there anything that you could give us advice for this group?
I wonder, and maybe this is not on target, But I do wonder if maybe there's a journal or something that might think about doing a special issue where it's less all empirical and more a bit like notes from the field, so that we get a real-time snapshot of what's actually happening in the field and how people are doing this, you know, in practice, like a little more case study based, so that we have, you know, because I, you know, as a person who works heavily in research and, you know, in empirical data, like, you know, we're trained and we can crank stuff out, but it's important, I think, to also have the boots on the ground piece of that. And I wonder if maybe there's a journalist somewhere that might accept or think about doing something like that.
Yeah. I can think of one to ask right off the top of my head. So that would
Right. And so if you were thinking of like a cross stigma journal, I would suggest Stigma and Health, which is a journal that I'm an associate editor for. And I could suggest this to our main editor, Pat, you know, about thinking about a special issue maybe that would be focused on, you know, anti-stigma efforts across different domains, right? So the journal has an inclusive perspective that includes HIV, stigma, mental health stigma, obesity, you know, a whole range of different areas that are studied. And so
what stigma doesn't affect health, you know?
Right. I mean, it's, yeah, so it could be how it affects on health or if it's related to health conditions, right? So yeah, so it could cover just about anything.
Okay, so there's an action
but I mean, that
Good
might be an idea. Again, the editor would have to agree to it. Special issue. I mean, there's, you know.
Might be a proposal process.
Yeah.
Okay. Other people, different kinds of things? I mean, please do ask, Phil.
I'm thinking about how it's important in my mind to lay out you know, there's internal stigmatism and then stigmatism, listen to me. It's getting late. Anyway, there's external and external, internal and external. And if you're dealing with stigma internally, there's a lot of different mechanisms that are going to work for you, that it's going to build resilience, that are going to help you deal with the external, but they're not going to solve the external. That's a more, you know, it's more macro. And I think it's important to make that statement and to figure out, you know, where you're going to focus. Of course, you want to focus on both as a clinician or as someone that is in a leadership role. But you know, from a client's perspective, you know, I'm interested in how to help them deal with that internalized stigma. So I just wanted to throw that out there. The resilience, how to be resilient.
Okay, so resources around that's for those who are trying to help other people directly to build resilience and cope with internalized stigma or the threat of that. Do we have that right?
Yeah, I think of it more as tools that I can give people so they can help themselves. But
okay, thanks. Mm-hmm. No, it's an important distinction. Thank you.
Yeah.
And that sort of suggests something like a centralized website or something that would have that information in one place, right? So, you know, you could email Alicia, you know, about ending self-stigma, or you could email me about narrative enhancement cognitive therapy, but, you know, why can't we have everything in one place, sort of?
Right. Yes, CBT is, I mean,
you can check it out and you can see what's available and you can.
Well, along that vein too is if you have that central location, you can also start finding a platform now that, you know, the internet, it's pretty accessible, at least by phone for most people, of building community too, because I think that's like to break down the internalized stigma, having a support system is really important to that. So it's not only resources, but also ways to connect with other folks who are going through the same journey or who might be further down the road, who then can kind of be supportive there for you as well.
That's certainly a mission. Yeah, it's a good point, Vicky. Good addition, right? Okay, so that's another good idea. I'm literally writing these things down, and we will be trying to act on them, and we will be in touch with you to see if you're interested. Other things that would help you do your work and support, you know, the efforts you're engaged in. Yep, I see the things that you're putting in the chat. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Emily. Yeah, I like these ideas a lot, and just building off of Vicky's point and others. So certainly clinical resources we have put on there, but like resources for the community too, right? If I'm a community member looking at this, like what can I do? Who can I contact? Who can I join up with? Who can I partner with?
Yeah.
Sorry.
So we do have the very nascent beginnings of at least connecting, in that we have a Google group. The link to that is in the conference details for this session. You know, when you scroll through, it talks about each of the interest group, and it tells you this group is doing it by Google. Here's the link to join. And so that is not what we were talking about, but it's at least a way to stay in touch, and that it is a place we're trying to grow, just so that we can all, you know, be in touch with each other across so many different configurations. So I encourage you to please think about that. It's not high traffic. We would like it to be a little higher traffic, let's just say, because you're free to share things and ask things too. It's not like it's one directional or top down or anything.
I did sign up for that, but I'm not clear if it's going to send me emails or if I have to like go look at the, you know, the
it should
documents.
It should send you emails, just like
okay.
old-fashioned listserv.
Has anyone sent anything recently?
I don't think since you've joined, Phil.
Okay, because that's why I haven't gotten any. So I'm like,
the new people, new introductions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So perhaps we will make a point of doing that after the conference with some, you know, invitations, next steps. Some of the people who are on there are not here, you know, all that. And those who are still listening from the sort of presentation side or the audience side, you know, please do feel free to go back to that listing and click so that you can join the Google group. We'll be happy. It will say that we have to approve you. That is just to, you know, cut down on bots and randomness. It's not like any, you know, stringent application process or anything. It's literally just Joe or I goes click. So that we will be happy to welcome you, whether you've participated today or not. There's a lot of different ways that people connect. So we will follow up there. And if for some reason that does not work for somebody, but you want to be in touch, feel free to contact Emily or Joe or me or each other. You don't need us. You know, individually as well. Would be happy to try to create what you're talking about, you know, a little bit of community so that resources can cycle better. And particularly, I think this conference, because it brings things across different stigmatized identities. And I think there's a lot of potential there, both in terms of commonalities and in terms of unique dynamics of experiences. So thank you for the work that you're doing and for being part of this. It's really great. Other, I don't know, closing comments that any of our esteemed panelists have? Anybody else, other things you want to say before we sort of run out of time and need to go to other parts of our lives? Anybody?
Good to see you.
Thanks, Emily. You are above and beyond ambassador, duh. Thank you for putting it in this chat as well, so people don't even have to go back and scroll there. Thank you. I wasn't thinking.
Yes, I was just saying, good to see everybody, and nice to, you know, meet with people who are interested in similar things.
Yeah.
Yeah, nice to meet everybody.
Mm-hmm. Likewise, this was nice.
Thanks for putting up with the technology.
Thank you.
We will be in touch.
Okay.
Okay. Great.
Bye.
Bye.
Good night.
Take care. See you at something